the article by McKee, which you'll get an abstract of, so you'll see what he says. I'll tell you in brief now as well. But there was a lot of attention given to Wohler's synthesis, and he was credited with the refutation of vitalism, because you no longer needed a kidney to produce urea. You could get it from ammonium cyanate, and simply by heating it up, if I remember correctly, at 90 degrees centigrade, he got what he thought was organic urea. And that's maybe one of the major points to make for this whole course. Is an artificial synthetic entity equal to an organic entity?
You say McKee or?
Yeah, M-C-K-I-E. And McKee finally got tired of the legend around urea and debunked it. And he did so by somehow coming across a eulogy that was written when Wohler died. And the guy that wrote the eulogy credits him with the refutation of vitalism. And McKee takes exception to that and says, no, he didn't really refute vitalism because he hadn't made a clean synthesis. There were organic elements in his synthesis, which didn't mean that it was a strictly artificial synthesis. And apparently there was some bone, I don't know why, but he makes reference to the fact that it wasn't a clean synthesis. When I read his refutation, I thought, no, this guy, he's a Scottish chemist, but he was also interested in the philosophy of science, which is why he took umbrage over Wohler being credited with the refutation of urea, because I thought he doesn't want a smoking gun. I mean, urea became the smoking gun for the refutation of vitalism. And McKee wanted to remove that as a reference point for people in order to make the case somehow more amorphous or less defined. If there's no single experiment to point to, then it's all a matter of carbon composition and blah, blah, blah. I mean, carbon figures centrally in the distinction between organic and inorganic nature. So that's already a problem that you really should try to figure out a little bit on your own. What is the difference between inorganic and organic? And my point is that after the synthesis of urea, organic nature was collapsed into the inorganic on the way to matter. And matter's all that matters. And matter is a combination of physical and chemical forces and the substance of the physicalist oath. That's all anybody needs to be concerned with, because that's all anything is. And that's the character of the oath. And they rub it in by saying, don't pay attention to any other forces unless they're equal in dignity to a physical chemical force. The implication being that no vital force, which is suspect in principle, can be equal in dignity to a physical chemical force.
Does dignity have a technical definition?
No, that's a kind of a joke. And then I've even read where they did the physicalist oath as a joke. They weren't serious. They were fooling around. They had a sense of humor. And then where they're taking it in blood came from, I have no idea, except the reference that I found in Julian Jaynes, which I indicate in the book, in his book on the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. It's one of those really strange books that became a kind of underground classic. And in that book, he talks about how the oath was taken in blood. And then I did give you the reference to Hans Jonas, who does a critique of the oath as taken by physicalists, because it's a contradiction in principle. How can a physicalist take a loyalty oath, in effect, when they haven't a clue about what loyalty is, as a physicalist? That's a clever refutation. Jonas became a hero of mine, and I ran on it to him fairly late. I'd say maybe 15 years ago. I had read him some 10 or 15 years before that. And he has this book called The Phenomenon of Life. So I thought, oh, and I read it, and it's got this arcane first chapter with a title that I simply am not capable of memorizing, and I have to look it up every time. It's such a life, death, and the body in the theory of being. Life, death, and the body in the theory of being. Who can remember that? Life, death, and the body in the theory of being. Maybe I can memorize it now. And he's a German emigre. He came over because he had to get out of Germany thanks to Hitler. He was Jewish. A very interesting academic figure. He was famous early on in his career for writing the classic book on Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a long-standing philosophical, movement in Europe that, how do you define it? It kind of means being initiated into a private knowledge that other Gnostics share with you. So there's an implied initiation that you're taken into the mystery of knowledge and what there is to be known by way of Gnosticism. And, gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge, but this is knowledge in a kind of esoteric way that's private, that you are initiated into. It was a big movement in early Europe.
Gnosticism?
Gnosticism.
So
Gnosis is the...
But Gnosticism is also predating Christ and was
Yeah, right.
was the school which he was raised in the desert, wasn't that?
yeah,
Nah.
yeah. Jesus was a Gnostic.
Yeah, he was not.
Yeah, and he was a raw foodist.
A
They were
who?
raw foodist.
A raw foodist. Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
the Gnostics
One of
were
those.
raw foodists.
Are you sure he wasn't a breatharian?
No, I've read the Gnostics.
He could have
I
been a
like the
breatharian.
Oh,
That's even better.
maybe.
We had a breatharian that came to Santa Cruz
Oh, I think I met him.
years ago. Did you really?
Yes, I did.
A little black guy?
No, this guy was white.
Oh, this was a little black guy, and all he did was inhale.
Oh, right. Oh.
And somebody once found him sneaking into a McDonald's. And as long as we're on the
Use
subject,
the toilet.
There.
He's just going to use the toilet.
Yeah, he wasn't gonna eat anything.
Rupert Sheldrake makes reference to a woman in India who hasn't had any food or liquid for 30 years.
Wow.
When her husband died, it was customary for the wife to throw herself on the funeral pyre of her dead husband. And she was going to do that, and they managed to intercept her and prevented her from doing it. And so in that moment, she made a vow that she wouldn't eat or drink again. And 30 years later, Rupert goes to visit her because of this reputation. And he's slightly skeptical about it. I mean, who wouldn't be? And he seems, she has an entourage about her, people that don't exactly worship her, but venerate her. And he was convinced that it's probably genuine. And he makes reference to another case of a yogi who hadn't taken any food for many years, and they have him come to a hospital to observe him for 3, 4, 5 days, and he doesn't take any food or drink. So it's all related to the Indian idea of prana, that the breath and the air have nourishing characteristics. And yogis are able to tap into that, as apparently this woman. So Jesus wasn't a breatharian or a vegetarian or
A Gnostic?
a Gnostic.
Really?
Nah.
Well,
A sadhu? Was he a
some might
sadhu?
argue.
Huh?
A sadhu? Was he a sadhu?
No. I mean, did he sleep on nails? No.
That would be a fakir.
Now, there is a whole tradition about Jesus as a wonder worker that has been more or less submerged, but it's come out that, the miracles and so on, so that he has the characteristic of an ancient magician, and that's interesting analysis. So, where was I? Yeah, where was I? How did we get into all that?
Life, death, and the body.
Oh, Hans Jonas.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I read Jonas fairly early on. I can't remember the year. And I don't get it. I mean, he has a German style, which you have to get used to. I already had gotten used to Tillich's German style. When my wife first heard him lecture, she didn't understand a word he said because his accent was so thick. When he came to speak at St. Olaf, he gave 3 lectures on existentialism. I didn't understand a word, but I knew it was my fault. And it was because of this thick German accent that you had to get used to. Well, Jonas has a kind of characteristically style that is Germanic. And so he's extremely fluent in English. That's the case, but you got to get used to the style because the words, the sentences are fairly elliptical. They're sentences constructed in such a way that you're not quite used to them. But once you read them enough, you get it. So anyhow, the first time I read them, I didn't get it. And I wasn't really onto my physicalist vitalist theme anyhow. So some years later, a couple of decades later, one of my best friends who pursued a lot of these themes with me said, you should read them again. So then I read them again and it clicked. And it was revelatory because this is my guy. I mean, everything that I'm striving toward and trying to attain, he's formulated for me. It was a higher order act of abstract conceptual formalization. And it was though, I found it. And it came through like a ton of bricks. And I was so grateful to him. And what had happened is that I had taken the challenge that the garden ruined the cause of science here on the campus into an inquiry about how could that be said to me. Oh, it was by an organic chemist. Well, is that what he's talking about? He's quarreling over the word organic? And that we're a throwback, a setback for the meaning of organic because it's been taken over by organic chemistry? And it really means artificial and synthetic? I mean, give me a break. I'm supposed to believe that Tang is orange juice? I mean, how far are they going to carry this? And that factories are plants. Oh yeah, I get it. There's some kind of funny consequence in the nature of common language, ordinary language, as a result of this takeover by organic chemistry and the undermining of the integrity of organic nature. So it took me back to the synthesis of urea. That was the smoking gun. And it just was confirmed everywhere I looked as far as pursuing that line of thought. Wohler had refuted vitalism in his synthesis. He didn't need a kidney. And it was the first time, or at least reportedly one of the first times, where an organic substance was made from inorganic material. In this case, ammonium cyanate. Okay? So then, because of my collaboration with Ralph Abraham, who's one of my best friends, and a very brilliant mathematician, we got onto a kind of Euclid project. And I was thrilled to work on the history of geometry with him because I failed high school geometry. And I still can't add or subtract. I mean, even that's gone now in old age. But Ralph was very concerned and interested in the history of Euclid and how Euclid made a major impact wherever Euclid went in Western culture, from major civilizational centers to another. And it started out with our taking an interest in Euclid coming to England under a figure named John Dee, D-E-E, in which Ralph and I took a major interest. And so through are working on Euclid. I was interested in the history of mathematics, the philosophy of mathematics. And so that took me back to Galileo and the mathematization of nature. When Galileo applied Euclid to astronomy and so on, but became an atomist in doing it. So I was able to go back from the 18th century synthesis urea, 19th century synthesis urea, 1828. That was the organic chemistry set, and I could go back to mathematical physics with Galileo, and that covered the entire history of modern science, if it's okay to say that it's inaugurated by Galileo, which is the common view. What Jonas did in this article I'm making reference to, the first chapter of his book, is to take me back to the ancient world, and how the ancient world was characterized by vitalism, by panpsychism, and by hylozoism. Now you can take those three terms as roughly synonymous. And they're all related to the fact that everything is alive. It's a reversal of materialism and atomism. And I was familiar with that to the extent that I had studied ancient philosophy and Homer. And I knew that clouds and winds and streams and rivers all were personified because they were powers of being. And they were given names as part of the personification. And, in a way, worship, because they were gods. They weren't just bodies of water or winds as such. They were powers of being that were personified. And the first figure in ancient Greek philosophy, Thales, who's famous for saying water is the original source, the key to being, also said everything is full of gods. And that's as marvelous a statement as you could get for the Greek view, that's animistic, vitalist, hylozoic, and panpsychic. So suddenly I had the entire history of Western culture in a nutshell, because Jonas demonstrates in what he discusses that this ancient worldview that's based on the mystery of death and the difference between life and death. Life was so burgeoning with everybody that it wasn't really a mystery. It was in your face. What was the big mystery and the big origin of perplexity was death for the ancient world. And Jonas says this shifted like that. It's a bifurcation with Galileo, where the big mystery becomes life because the shift has been made toward death.